Hi, so my presentation is about the Mexican military and how it did not benefit from this time period in Mexico's history. So here we have a picture of the student protest of 1968, which we will get into. So, an overview, the Mexican military over the years have, as we've read in the textbook, it's always been, the government has always made it its first priority. Its revenue has always gone to the military. And while everyone else is really getting left out. But as we're going to see here during these years, the 1940s to the 70s, really it starts to shift. It doesn't go from the old traditional Mexican military we know and government. It starts to shift to a more modern military where when what I mean by that is not all the government's money is going into the military, but just, the military is declining in in uh in everyday life, And here I put a picture of former Mexican President Diaz Ordaz, because so during Avila Camacho, the president before him, military budget, it was at 18.85%, and during his time it would decreased all the way to 2.63%, and that's really a really big decline, because Avila Camacho was in office for 6 years. So starting in 1946 all the way to the end of his term, he brought it down all the way to that, and that's a really big jump. So during World War II, so here I have a picture of the Mexican Air Force. So the Mexico actually did enter the World War II after the Germans sank two ships, and they joined the allies. So the US, they invested into Mexico. And what I mean by invest is that they really helped them to make sure that their troops were trained and they had the right artillery and equipment, machinery, whatever. So they gave them coastal artillery, 305 aircrafts, and, gave them training. And this still tied in, not even after post-World War II. So after the war, 1946 to 1971, the U.S. still gave aid to Mexico in its military, and it gave in between all those years, 1946 to 1971, approximately $17.6 million, and that equals less than 1% of what the U.S. gave all the other Latin American countries. For example, I don't know, Salvador, Peru, Argentina, Chile. I'm just imagining, but yeah, that was less than 1%. And from the 50s all the way to the 60s, the U.S. trained, 61,000 troops in Latin American countries, but only 659 came from Mexico. So what does this mean? All this money, aid going to the Mexico, all these troops being trained, and Mexico not setting that much. Its military wasn't as a priority, and part, I think that's because the pre had changed. It was more dominant. They had more control, they thought. So politics, the military. So back then, generals, they were, military men. They were the dictators. Now during this time, we see that that's not the case. More civilians are starting to take a part in politics. It's not all about former generals or former military officers. So the control, started shifting to civilians. And as we see here, this former president Avila Camacho, he was the last to be a military man in politics for 1946, and for 1964, for the it was started to be civilians. So as we can see here, shifted from 15 governors who were former officers in the military to only one between these years. So, and scandals. So the press really, they try to be ignorant. They try to cover up military military abuse. Some of it they couldn't, such as this one, the I don't know how if I'm pronouncing this right, the Tlatelolco massacre of 1968, which was a student movement. Because the military, they were in charge of stopping political social unrest. But this one, it marked really the end of all the movements, you can say. There were others, such as the 1946 in Leon and the 1956, where they were trying to suppress the National Polyethnic Institute. But this was a big one, really, because, what began in July and ended in October. It led to many deaths and many arrests, which started as police trying to break up a street fight, led to a protest, led to a massacre. And all in all, I think the military really didn't benefit during this time period.